They told you that history is a story, that the past is a series of events shaped by men and women of virtue, honor, and faith. That the institutions that stood at the heart of 19th century America were pillars of morality, their leaders torchbearers of righteousness. They told you that the wealthy families who built schools, churches, and charities did so from the goodness of their hearts. But if you've lived long enough, if you've learned to listen to the undertones behind the official stories, you know there is another truth. You know that the most respectable faces often hide the deepest rot. That when a family carries power for generations, their wealth and their legacy are not just built on industry and vision, but on secrets, dark, predatory, unholy secrets. Tonight, you're going to hear about one of those families. And once you hear it, you'll understand why their name was scrubbed from the history books. You'll understand why the archives are sealed. And you'll understand why men in positions of power even now, over 2 centuries later, still flinch when the name Fairfax is spoken aloud. It begins in the autumn of 1848, but the seed was planted decades before. Workmen, demolishing the abandoned St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, uncovered something that should never have been found. Beneath the chapel floorboards, in a lead-lined box, they discovered 47 small leather-bound journals. Each belonged to a different girl. The handwriting varied, some neat, some clumsy, some with spelling errors that told of an interrupted education, but all contained the same undercurrent. They spoke of nights they could not remember, mornings they awoke sore and bruised, punishments they did not understand, and prayers whispered into the dark, unanswered. The journals were more than confessions, they were evidence. And alongside them was a ledger meticulously kept listing names that read like a directory of New England's political and mercantile elite, governors, judges, bankers, clergymen, men whose public legacies were stainless, but whose private appetites bled through every inked line. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts sealed the findings within hours. Public safety, they claimed. The truth would cause irreparable harm to the good order of the state. And so, the records remain locked away, not in some forgotten cabinet, but in a guarded section of the state archives, accessible only to a select few under orders of silence. I came into possession of fragments, copies of testimony, smuggled pages from those journals, and the dying confession of a woman who lived long enough to see the Fairfax family lose its grip on the town, but not before they destroyed more lives than can be counted. If you think you've heard dark stories before, I promise you, you have not heard this one. The Fairfax name is a cipher, a doorway into a labyrinth of manipulation, of moral theater masking systemic abuse, of piety used as a hunting blind. And the deeper we go, the harder it will be to pretend you can return to the world you knew before. Salem in 1811 was not the Salem of the witch trials, though the shadow of that madness still lay heavy across its cobbled streets. By the early 19th century, the town was determined to reforge its reputation, no longer a place of superstition and hysteria, but a beacon of Protestant morality and educational reform. The Fairfax family arrived into this climate of redemption, like angels descending from the Southern aristocracy. Victoria Fairfax, widowed at 32 after the death of her husband in a Charleston yellow fever outbreak, carried herself like a queen in exile, tall, graceful, with eyes the color of cold steel that seemed to size up and consume whatever they landed on. Born to a wealthy Virginia plantation dynasty, educated in Philadelphia and London, she embodied refinement. And when she declared her intention to open a school for girls free for orphans and the impoverished, but also welcoming the daughters of the wealthy, the town embraced her as a savior. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies was presented as a sanctuary from the corrupting influences of the modern world. Here, young women would learn not only literature, music, and needlework, but the moral discipline needed to resist Satan's temptations. Victoria's younger sister, Evangeline, would teach music and French. Her brother-in-law Bartholomew, a gaunt, deep-voiced preacher whose sermons on female purity could chill the blood, would serve as chaplain. Parents who heard him speak were moved to tears, convinced that their daughters' souls would be guarded as fiercely as their bodies. But what no one asked, what no one wanted to ask, was who would guard them from the guardians. The building itself was a 3-story Georgian mansion perched on Beacon Hill, overlooking the harbor. It had a history, whispers of curses, of families fleeing after months, of nights when the windows glowed, though no one was inside. Victoria dismissed the talk as ignorance, buying the property for a fraction of its value and commissioning renovations. The chapel was her pride, stained glass of female saints gazing down with solemn eyes, a place where prayers would mingle with the scent of candle wax and polished wood. Dormitories for 30 girls, a dining hall for 50, and on the 3rd floor, a series of private meditation rooms, where girls could supposedly reflect in solitude. The first intake of students arrived in September 1811, 23 girls, aged 12 to 17. Some from prominent Salem families paying $50 a year, a sum heavy enough to keep the student body refined. But more than half were charity students, girls with no families, or with families too poor to protest if anything went wrong. Margaret Sullivan, 14, red-haired and quick-witted, rescued from a textile mill. Priscilla Morse, 15, bookish, solemn, unwanted by her uncle after her parents died. Hannah Whitmore, 13, pale, abandoned by a mother who could no longer bear the shame of her husband's imprisonment. They entered the academy with gratitude shining in their eyes, believing they had been chosen for salvation. They had no way of knowing they had been chosen for something else entirely. The first signs were subtle. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a local seamstress delivering linens to the academy, began noticing things: a carriage at the side entrance before dawn, men stepping quickly inside with collars turned up, hats pulled low. Visitors always after dark, always avoiding the main doors. The students changed too. The laughter and chatter faded. They moved as if underwater. Some bore bruises, explained away as clumsiness. Margaret's vibrant hair dulled. Her spirit dimmed. Once, Mrs. Thornton caught her gaze through a window and felt the weight of a silent plea, a look that said, "Help me," though her lips never moved. On the night of December 13, 1812, Mrs. Thornton saw light flickering in the chapel, unsteady, like torchlight. Then, muffled screams, human, female, short bursts, followed by silence more chilling than the sound itself. She stood at her window, the cold glass against her face, and watched shadows move behind the stained glass saints. The noise lasted nearly an hour. 3 days later, Hannah Whitmore was dead. "Sudden fever," said Victoria. Buried in the Academy Cemetery under a plain cross. No family to mourn her. 2 more followed in February: Priscilla Morse, peaceful in her sleep, and Mary O'Brien, seized by convulsions until her body gave out. All declared natural causes by the Academy's physician, who happened to be Victoria's cousin. The funerals were private, behind chapel doors. Hymns sung in voices trembling with something far more primal than grief. From the outside, nothing changed. Visitors came. Donations flowed. Victoria spoke of moral fortitude and the trials God sends to test the faithful. But Mrs. Thornton kept watching, and she saw the pattern. The girls who weakened, who vanished, were always the ones without family. The paying students stayed healthy. The others were being used. For what? No one dared say aloud. This is where most stories end, with suspicion, with whispers. But the Fairfax story keeps going, because the machine they built wasn't just about satisfying depravity. It was about power. Those side door visitors? Many of them sat on Salem's governing council. Some controlled shipping empires, banks and churches. Each had something to lose if the academy fell. Each, therefore, had reason to protect it. And so, the institution endured. feeding on the forgotten, while above it all, the Fairfax name shone untarnished. You think evil announces itself with smoke and brimstone. It doesn't. It dresses in black silk, speaks in scripture, and offers charity with one hand while tightening a noose with the other. That was the Fairfax way. And if you think this is just a story about one family in one town 200 years ago, you're not paying attention. Because the Fairfax method, using morality as a mask, institutions as a hunting ground, and charity as a weapon, did not die with them. It simply changed its name. And if you look closely at the foundations of the institutions you trust today, you might see their fingerprints still pressed deep in the mortar. The night had settled over the mountains like a thick shroud, muffling every sound except for the slow whisper of the wind threading through the pines. In the darkness, shapes seemed to move just beyond the reach of sight, and every shadow stretched longer than it should have, as though the very land itself was bending under the weight of what it held. The village at the valley's base lay silent, its narrow dirt paths winding between weather-worn houses whose walls still bore scars from fires long past. Most of the doors were shut tight, barred from the inside, but here and there, a faint flicker of candlelight bled through wooden shutters, hinting that someone within had chosen wakefulness over the uneasy comfort of sleep. It was not a night to dream. In the hills above, a lone figure moved with careful steps, their boots silent against the damp earth. Every breath controlled, every sense sharpened by an awareness that something unseen was watching. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, yet to fall, mingled with something faint but unsettling and acrid tang. Like old iron, the figure's path led them toward the ruins of the monastery, a place abandoned decades ago after the last great sickness had swept through the valley. The walls still stood, though in places they had crumbled into heaps of stone that jutted like bones from the earth. Legends told that the monks had not truly left, that their voices still echoed in the halls, chanting prayers in a tongue no one had spoken for centuries. Some swore they had seen lights moving through the empty corridors on nights just like this, the glow bobbing and swaying as though carried by unseen hands. The figure paused at the edge of the courtyard, their eyes scanning the cracked flagstones, the ivy-choked arches, the gaping windows that stared like empty sockets. A single crow sat perched on a broken spire, its head cocked unnaturally to one side, watching in utter stillness. The wind shifted, and with it came a low, distant sound halfway between a moan and a hum that seemed to roll down the mountain slopes. It was not the voice of a storm, nor the cry of an animal. It had a rhythm to it, almost deliberate, as though something was calling. The figure's heart tightened in their chest, but they pressed on, stepping into the monastery's outer hall. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scent of stone dust and the faint, musty breath of long-forgotten things. The beam of a lantern swept across the walls, revealing faded murals, the colors bled pale by time. In the dim light, the painted faces of saints seemed to twist, their eyes shifting to follow every movement. It was a trick of shadow, perhaps, but it set a chill crawling along the spine. Deeper in, the corridor narrowed until it was barely wide enough for one person to pass. The figure trailed their fingers along the wall, feeling the grooves where centuries of hands had worn the stone smooth. Ahead, the sound returned louder now and unmistakably closer. It was a voice, deep and resonant, yet not entirely human. Words formed within the sound, though none that belonged to any language the figure knew. Their steps slowed, but the pull to continue was stronger than fear. At last they reached the great hall, its high roof supported by blackened beams, its floor littered with fallen plaster, and fragments of shattered icons dot in the center stood something that did not belong. A circle of symbols carved deep into the stone floor surrounded a low altar made from black rock that glistened as though wet. The markings were unfamiliar, their shapes jagged and unnatural, each one etched with such precision that it seemed impossible they had been made by human hands. The air within the circle seemed heavier, denser, as though the space itself resisted. Being entered. The voice swelled again, but now it was not from somewhere distant. It was coming from inside the altar, as though the stone itself was breathing words. The figure crouched low, the lantern's light trembling as their hands shook, casting frantic shadows against the walls. Then, without warning, the flame guttered and died. The darkness that followed was absolute. The voice stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the pounding of their own heart. And then, from the black, came a sound far more terrifying than the voice, a slow, deliberate scraping, as though something with claws was dragging itself across the floor toward them. The figure stumbled backward, hands groping for the wall. Breath quick and shallow. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it was right before them. And then, with an almost curious gentleness, something cold brushed against their leg. They did not wait to feel more. They turned and ran, the sound of pursuit behind them, too close, too fast, until the sudden burst of moonlight through the monastery's broken doors sent them hurtling into the open night. They did not stop until the village lights were in sight, their legs trembling, their lungs burning. Yet even then, the feeling of being watched clung to them, pressing in from the darkness beyond the path. When they finally reached their own door, they slammed it shut, bolting it with hands that would not stop shaking. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying with it that strange hum once more, but now it was fainter, retreating toward the hills. The figure sank to the floor, staring into the blackness beyond the shuttered windows, knowing deep down that whatever was in the monastery had not been trapped there for decades, as the stories claimed. It was awake, and it knew they had been there. Sleep never came to the village that night. Those who were still awake swore they heard footsteps in the streets long past midnight, slow and unhurried, as though someone or something was taking its time to memorize every door. In the morning, no footprints could be found on the rain-soft earth, yet several of the shutters that had been closed the night before now hung wide open. And in the far distance, up in the hills where the monastery lay hidden in shadow, a black spire of smoke curled toward the pale sky, though no fire had been lit there for half a century. The figure who had ventured into that place said nothing to anyone, but the silence between them and the rest of the village grew heavy, for they knew something no one else wanted to believe, that the ruins were not empty, and that some doors, once opened, could never truly be shut again. The morning after the second disappearance dawned with a pale, reluctant light, as if the sun itself had been warned to keep its distance from Pleasant Valley. Frost clung to the splintered fence posts and bare orchard limbs like a thin veil of glass, refracting the weak glow into a shimmer that looked almost too delicate to be real. The townsfolk moved slower than usual, their footsteps crunching in the brittle grass, their eyes scanning the ground in quiet suspicion, as though the earth itself might reveal what it had swallowed. Sheriff Amos Granger stood at the edge of the Shaker Meeting House field, hat brim low, breath steaming in the cold air, staring at the patch of flattened grass where the missing woman's footprints had ended. They didn't fade or scatter like a wanderer changing direction. They simply stopped, as if she'd been plucked from existence. The elder Shaker women moved in small, murmuring knots nearby, shawls drawn tight, their hands clasped not in prayer, but in something closer to dread. Somewhere in the distance, a lone woodpecker tapped against a dying elm, the sound sharp and rhythmic, like a code only the forest could understand. That day, the townspeople began locking their doors in the daylight, a habit foreign to a place where nobody had stolen so much as a chicken in 30 years. The children, once free to roam the meadows and brookside, were kept close, their games confined to yards under the watchful eyes of mothers who tried to appear calm, but couldn't hide the quickness with which they looked toward the tree line. By afternoon, a hush fell over Main Street, broken only by the creak of the postmaster's sign in the wind. People spoke in fragments now, trailing off mid-thought, glancing around before finishing their sentences, as if an unseeing listener might be leaning in just out of sight. Rumors began to take root, not in the open, but in kitchen corners, behind the counter at the feed store, and in the dim back pews after Sunday sermons. Some whispered about a hidden well or sinkhole on Shaker land, some about a family curse that had never been broken, and others, in tones barely louder than a breath, about a presence older than the town itself, something that lived in the gaps between sound and shadow. The Shakers, bound by their vows of simplicity and separation from worldly fears, offered no explanations, only saying, "God calls whom he will," a phrase that rang hollow to those burying empty coffins. Sheriff Granger spent that week combing every inch of the property with a few volunteers, each man holding a lantern at dusk, the flicker of light bouncing across frost-laced grass and skeletal trees. They found nothing, no scrap of fabric, no dropped shoe, no sign of a struggle. Only once did something happen that made them stop in their tracks. As they passed the old herb garden, long since overgrown, every lantern flame dipped low at the same moment, as though a hand had passed over them. One of the men swore he heard a low hum beneath the wind, like a choir singing from underground. But when they all stopped to listen, the night was silent. That silence became its own kind of threat, a weight pressing in from all sides. The missing woman's home was left untouched, her bed neatly made, her Bible open on the table to a passage about the desert wandering of the Israelites. The only thing out of place was the back door unlocked, but without a single footprint in the frost beyond it. In the weeks that followed, 2 more vanished, both Shaker men this time, both last seen walking toward the meeting house at dusk. Each time, their paths ended the same way, footprints halting mid-stride, no trace of departure. The pattern was too exact to ignore, and yet no one could explain it without venturing into the kind of speculation that made even the most level-headed residents glance over their shoulders. A few outsiders, hearing the news through the slow creep of word of mouth, came to Pleasant Valley hoping to investigate or simply gawk. They didn't stay long. One pair of traveling salesmen, eager to see the haunted fields for themselves, returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they had seen. By the end of winter, the disappearances had become a wound in the town's fabric, an unspoken line dividing the before and after. The Shakers continued their routines, tending the fields, mending garments, singing hymns in the simple cadence that had always defined them. But there was a strain in their voices now, a slight falter on certain notes, as if they were singing to drown something else out. Late one night, Sheriff Granger found himself standing alone in the meeting house after following a flicker of candlelight through its cracked door. The room was empty, the benches lined in perfect order, but the air was thick with a scent he couldn't place something between damp earth and iron. As he turned to leave, he noticed a faint impression in the dust by the far wall. Not quite a footprint, not quite a handprint, but something that suggested both. He bent to study it, and the candle flame beside him sputtered violently before going out, plunging the room into darkness. In that instant, he felt it not the touch of a hand, but the overwhelming certainty that he was not alone, that something unseen was studying him with an intensity colder than the frost outside. He left without looking back, locking the door behind him, though he knew a lock meant little against whatever had taken root here. As March approached, the frost began to retreat, but the unease did not. If anything, the thaw seemed to deepen it, revealing patches of earth that looked freshly disturbed, though no one claimed to have dug there. In one such patch near the orchard, a child found a small carved figure, faceless, worn smooth by age, its arms folded tightly against its chest. The Shaker elders took it at once, saying only that it belonged to the land and must be returned, but they never revealed where they placed it. That night, the wind rose to a howl, rattling shutters and tearing branches from the trees. And in the chaos, more than one family swore they heard voices in the gale, calling names that hadn't been spoken in years. The town's surface calm had become a brittle shell, a thin layer of civility stretched tight over a roiling undercurrent of dread that no one wanted to name. But everyone could feel as if the very air had grown heavier and more difficult to draw into the lungs, carrying with it whispers that seemed to slither into the ear without a source, whispers that spoke in fragmented sentences and half-remembered prayers, as though some ancient mouth was murmuring from beneath the ground, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. In the Shaker settlement, people began locking their doors earlier, the clinking of the bolts echoing like gunshots in the silence of the fading evening light, while children were kept indoors entirely, no longer allowed to play in the woods or near the barns, their mothers' hands tightening around their shoulders whenever a shadow passed by the window. And the men, despite their pious vows, began carrying hatchets or hunting knives at their belts under their coats, a quiet acknowledgement that the invisible line between faith and survival had thinned to the point of snapping. Father Elijah, though his voice in sermons remained steady, had grown paler in the face and slower in his step, pausing sometimes mid-sentence as if listening to something the rest of them could not hear. And though no one dared speak of it openly, some swore they had seen him in the dead of night walking toward the old meeting hall alone, barefoot in the frost, his lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps conversation. The stories of strange sights multiplied: lanterns swaying where no wind blew, the faint sound of singing from the forest at night, a woman's voice low and melodic, drawing anyone who lingered too close into the tree line before vanishing abruptly, leaving only the sensation that something unseen was standing directly behind you, breathing softly against the nape of your neck. The animals were not spared from this disquiet. Horses refused to enter the lower pasture. Goats bleated and kicked against their pens at night. Dogs cowered and whimpered toward the corners of their kennels, their eyes tracking something invisible moving along the walls. Twice, hunters returning from the valley swore they had found large, perfectly circular depressions in the snow, as if something had descended from above and rested there without leaving a trail to or from the spot. The ice at the center oddly melted despite the deep cold, as though some immense weight had pressed down with unnatural heat. The elders, trying to maintain the fragile order, dismissed these as tricks of the mind or nature, yet even their voices lacked conviction, their eyes sliding away from the speaker as though afraid the lie might summon the truth. It was Isaac Granger, the cooper, who finally broke the uneasy silence of denial. His wife, Sarah, had not returned from the communal well one late afternoon, her bucket found still half full at the edge of the path, the rope damp and swinging as if she had just let go. Search parties scoured the settlement, torches throwing long jerking shadows over the snow, but there was no sign of her, not a footprint leading away, not a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, only the low hum of the wind threading through the pines like a mournful chant. Isaac, once a quiet and devout man, began raging in the center of the square, accusing the elders of knowing more than they told, his voice cracking with grief and fury until Father Elijah himself had to restrain him, whispering words that made Isaac's eyes go wide before he collapsed to his knees and refused to speak further. After that, people began to notice that those who had lost someone to the vanishings seemed to wither in strange ways, their hair turning white within weeks, their hands trembling uncontrollably, their dreams becoming so vivid and disturbing that they refused to sleep at all, muttering about voices calling them to come to the water or join the circle, until their minds frayed to the point where they could no longer tell waking from dreaming. The nights grew longer and colder, yet the darkness seemed to deepen beyond what the moon and stars could pierce, and more than one night watchman confessed to seeing shapes move at the far end of the lane, shapes that looked human until they turned to face the torchlight, revealing nothing but a blank stretch of shadow where a face should be. The settlement's meeting hall, once a place of song and communal joy, now echoed with tense gatherings where no hymns were sung, only grim discussions about whether to send for help from the towns beyond the valley, though that suggestion was always smothered quickly by the elders, who insisted that the covenant is ours to keep, and that outsiders would not understand nor survive it. The phrase "survive it" lodged itself in the minds of those present, though no one dared ask aloud what it meant. On the 12th night after Sarah Granger's disappearance, a terrible knocking began on the walls of several homes just before dawn, slow, deliberate, like a giant hand testing the wood for weakness. Yet when the doors were thrown open, there was nothing there but a faint, metallic smell on the air, sharp enough to make the eyes water. That same morning, the settlement awoke to find every single window of the meeting hall standing open despite the frost, and inside, on the floor where the morning light barely touched, a perfect ring of black ash, unbroken, the center completely clean, as if something had stood there, watching. The elders called it a sign, but the people did not know if it was meant as a warning or a claim. Fear now had a weight to it, a presence that pressed against the ribs, and even those who had clung to faith above all else began to wonder if they were not, in fact, living within the reach of something far older and far hungrier than they had ever been taught to imagine. Something that had chosen their isolated valley, not by accident, but by right, and that whatever bargain the elders whispered about and locked rooms was nearing its end, the payment due in flesh and devotion alike, with no promise that either would be enough to satisfy what waited in the dark. The night had deepened into a cold and merciless stillness, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing in on every living thing that still dared to breathe in that cursed corner of Kentucky. The last remnants of the storm had faded hours ago, leaving behind a sky scraped clean of clouds, the stars sharp and brittle like fragments of broken glass scattered across the heavens. Yet even under that brittle light, the woods surrounding the abandoned Shaker settlement seemed darker than before, as though the trees themselves were conspiring to swallow any trace of movement or sound. Agent Mallory's flashlight beam wavered. Over the warped planks of an old meeting hall, the wood swollen with decades of moisture, its surface mottled with dark streaks that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Behind her, the crunch of boots on wet earth belonged to Detective Hanlon, his breathing heavy, his earlier skepticism fraying at the edges. They had found the children's toys hours earlier, hand-carved wooden figures, their features disturbingly crude, each with the same vacant round hole where the eyes should be. Mallory had pocketed one without telling Hanlon, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the little figurine, though every time her fingers brushed its surface, a chill seemed to snake up her arm. In the distance, something creaked, not the wind, not the settling of old wood, but a measured sound, deliberate, like the slow opening of a door on rusted hinges. Hanlon froze, his head snapping toward the sound, his hand instinctively dropping to the pistol at his side. They both stood perfectly still, the air between them taut as a tripwire, until Mallory took a step forward, her light cutting into the black mouth of the meeting hall. The smell hit them first, damp rot mingled with something acrid, metallic, and old, as though the air itself had been steeped in rust for generations. Inside, rows of benches sat in perfect order, dust coating every surface except for the center aisle, where a narrow path of clean wood led to the raised platform at the far end. On that platform, an old wooden podium stood with its back to the wall, and just behind it, barely visible in the beam of her light, was a figure, not a person, at least not anymore. It was a mannequin, dressed in a simple linen robe, its head bowed, its hands folded neatly in front of it. But as they approached, they saw the head wasn't made of wood or porcelain. It was a human skull, the bone mottled with age, the empty sockets fixed eternally on nothing. Tucked between its teeth was a brittle piece of parchment, and though Mallory's hands trembled, she reached for it, unfolding it to reveal lines of spidery handwriting in faded ink. The words were an old Shaker script, but she could still read enough to understand their warning. "We did not leave. We were taken. The bell calls us home." As if on cue, the faint sound of a bell began to drift through the walls, low and resonant, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Hanlon muttered a curse under his breath, but Mallory was already moving, her light bouncing as she followed the sound. It was weaker now, almost like it was retreating, luring them onward. The trees closed in quickly, their skeletal branches clawing at the beam of her flashlight, until they emerged into a small clearing where the grass was pressed flat in a perfect circle. At the center stood a weathered wooden frame from which an iron bell hung, its surface blackened as if scorched. No wind moved, yet the bell swayed slightly, the tone dying into the earth beneath their feet. Hamlin approached it slowly, running, his fingers over the cracked wood of the frame, then stopping as his eyes caught something carved into one of the beams. It was a spiral, rough and uneven, like it had been cut in a hurry, but around its edges were symbols neither of them recognized, some looking vaguely like runes, others like crude depictions of human eyes. The ground inside the circle was soft, almost spongy, and when Hanlon pressed the toe of his boot into it, the earth gave way with an audible squelch, releasing a foul odor that made Mallory's stomach twist. She swung her light down and saw the earth was riddled with small, pale fragments, bones, tiny and delicate, like those of children. She felt her pulse quicken, but before she could speak, the air in the clearing shifted, growing heavy and electric, the kind of charged stillness that comes before lightning. The shadows deepened unnaturally, and somewhere beyond the trees, they both heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of the light. Hanlon drew his gun, his voice low and tight, telling Mallory to keep her light steady. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint, rasping whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once, speaking words neither of them understood, but which scraped at the edges of their minds like claws. Mallory's vision began to blur. At the edges, her thoughts swimming, the figurine in her pocket growing unbearably warm against her leg. The whispering grew louder, faster, overlapping itself until it became a single droning hum that made her teeth ache. Then, without warning, the bell rang again, not once, but 3 times, each note reverberating deep in her chest. The ground beneath their feet shifted, and in the dim light, they saw the soil inside the circle begin to ripple, as though something massive was moving just beneath the surface. Hanlon took a step back, his voice rising in alarm, but Mallory couldn't move, her gaze locked on the center of the circle where the earth suddenly broke open in a shower of dirt and bones. A hand emerged first, pale and impossibly long, its fingers tipped with nails that looked like shards of obsidian. Then came another hand, pulling up the contorted form of something that had once been human but had been stretched and twisted into something else entirely. Its skin was the color of wet ash, its mouth a lipless grin full of jagged teeth, and in its empty eye sockets burned 2 pinpricks of pale light. It stood slowly, unnervingly tall, the bell swaying gently behind it, and in a voice that was more felt than heard, it spoke the words from the parchment. "The bell calls us home." Hanlon fired, the shots deafening in the stillness, but the thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements oddly fluid, as though it were gliding just above the ground. Mallory finally tore her gaze away and stumbled back, grabbing Hanlon's arm and pulling him toward the trees. The thing moved after them, not rushing, but keeping pace no matter how fast they ran, its pale lights unblinking in the darkness. They broke through the tree line, crashing into the overgrown path that led back to the main settlement, but the sound of the bell followed them, each toll vibrating through their bones. They didn't stop until the lights of their SUV came into view, the vehicle sitting exactly where they'd left it on the edge of the gravel road. Hanlon threw open the driver's door and started the engine, the headlights cutting twin beams into the dark, but as Mallory slammed her door shut, she saw movement in the rearview mirror. The thing was standing at the edge of the woods, the bell now silent, its head tilted slightly as if studying them. Then, slowly, it raised one of those long skeletal hands and pointed directly at her. The figurine in her pocket burned hot again, and she knew without understanding how that she had been marked, not just by sight, but by something deeper, something that would follow her far beyond the borders of Kentucky. As Hanlon drove, gravel spraying under the tires, she kept her eyes on the side mirror until the figure was swallowed by darkness. Yet even when it was gone, the echo of the bell seemed to follow, tolling faintly in the depths of her skull, promising that the night's horrors were not an ending, but an invitation. The first snow of December came heavier than anyone in the valley expected, blanketing the abandoned Shaker settlement in a silence so thick it felt as if the world had been erased. By then, the disappearances had stopped, not because the mystery was solved, but because there was no one left to vanish. Only the wind moved through the warped wooden halls of the meeting house, and only the crows dared perch on its sagging roof. Yet for those who remained in the nearby towns, the fear had not faded. It had simply become part of the air they breathed. Every conversation still circled back to the same unspoken question: what had happened here? Sheriff Elridge had stopped visiting the place entirely after his last search ended with the dogs refusing to go any further past the gates. Locals whispered that the snow wasn't real snow at all, but ash-light, cold, and falling endlessly from somewhere above the treetops. The smell of the place had changed, too. It wasn't rot anymore, nor the damp smell of old wood, but something faintly sweet, like apples left too long in the sun. A trap for the senses, they said, meant to lure the curious deeper. Yet curiosity, for some, was stronger than fear. One of them was Reverend Jonah Pike, a man who had spent 30 years preaching the steadfast love of God, only to find his faith shaken by what had taken root in those hollow Shaker buildings. He had grown up near the settlement, and as a boy, he'd watched the Shakers sing in the fields, their hands moving in the strange, rhythmic motions outsiders never understood. His grandmother had told him that their songs could move heaven itself. That was before the rumors began. Now Jonah found himself standing at the settlement's edge once more, Bible in one hand, lantern in the other, convinced that whatever evil had swallowed the others could not stand before the word. He entered through the main gate at dusk, his breath white in the frozen air, the lantern throwing soft halos against the snow. There was no wind inside the boundary, no sound of the forest, only the quiet creak of the buildings as if they shifted in their sleep. Jonah walked the narrow path between the old workshop and the dining hall, each step sinking deep into the snow. He prayed aloud as he went, his voice shaking less from cold than from the weight of the stillness. It wasn't until he reached the meeting house that he noticed the track's bare footprints, small as a child's, leading from the doorway into the shadows inside. Jonah followed, his lantern's light stretching across the wide plank floor, revealing nothing but empty benches. The prince continued up the central aisle and stopped at the pulpit. Here, the air was warmer, and the smell of apples stronger, almost intoxicating. Jonah leaned forward, noticing something carved into the wood of the pulpit that had not been there in his youth. A perfect circle surrounded by dozens of tiny, interlocking shapes like human figures, all facing inward. He traced one with his finger, and for a moment it felt as though the wood pulsed beneath his touch, warm like living flesh. He drew his hand back quickly, heart pounding, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming now. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement, something small darting between the benches, too fast to be clearly seen. He turned, raising the lantern, but there was nothing there. The prints were gone. Jonah backed away from the pulpit, whispering prayers under his breath, when a sound rose from the floorboards beneath him, a low hum, like many voices singing in unison, muffled as if from underground. It was the same rhythm the Shakers had once used, the same cadence he remembered from summers long past, but slower now, heavier, almost mournful. The hum grew louder, and with it came a vibration under his boots, as though the building itself We're breathing. Jonah dropped his Bible, clutching the lantern with both hands, and stepped back toward the door. That was when the floor in front of him split with a sharp crack, and something pale began to push through a hand, slender and childlike, followed by another, then another. They clawed at the boards, pulling, writhing, and finally lifting a head with hollow eyes and a mouth that moved in silent song. More hands appeared all around, and Jonah realized too late that the singing wasn't coming from beneath the floor, it was coming from inside them. He turned and ran, stumbling into the snow outside, the lantern swinging wildly. He didn't stop until he reached the gate, where the silence returned all at once, crushing the sound of his breath. Behind him, the meeting house stood dark and still, the snow unbroken, as if he had never entered. The lantern's flames sputtered and went out, and in that dim light Jonah saw that his footprints, like the ones he had followed, were gone. He fell to his knees in the snow, unable to speak, unable to pray. By morning, he was found wandering the road into town, coat missing, eyes wide and unblinking. When they tried to speak to him, he began to hum a slow, mournful tune none of them recognized at first, until an old woman in the crowd began to weep. It was the Shaker hymn, she said, the one they sang when someone passed from this world to the next. Jonah never returned to his church, never spoke again, and by spring he was gone as well. His bed found empty one morning with the window open to the north. Those who heard his story secondhand dismissed it as the madness of a man too long burdened by grief. But the ones who knew the valley, who had seen the snow fall heavy and strange around the old settlement, kept their distance. They said the place was not abandoned at all, that it had simply changed its congregation. And every so often, on nights when the snow fell in absolute silence, they claimed you could hear it from the far end of town, a faint hum, almost like a song, carried on the air from somewhere no one dared go.